Hello, my name is Yul Sohn, President of East Asia Institute, EAI. I want to thank all of you to join the EAI's online seminar series on the New World Order. Today is the third this year. We feature an excellent and eminent thinker in the field of international relations and foreign policy, Dr. Richard Haass, who is today's speaker. He has been the president of Council on Foreign Relations for the past 18 years. CFR is the world-leading think tank and initiate the Council of Councils, a worldwide think tank network of which EAI is a proud and founding member. Previously, Richard served as Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State from 2001 to 2003. And he was a principal advisor to then Secretary of State Colin Powell. He was also special assistant to President George Bush from 1989 to 1993 and senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. He has been awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions and is a veteran diplomat. He writes a lot. He is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy. And his latest book is The World, A Brief Introduction, which we'll be discussing today. So welcome, Richard. We are lucky to have you here. Our moderator and discussant today is Dr. Young-Sun Ha, who is the chairman of the Board of Trustees at East Asia Institute, and is also a professor emeritus at Seoul National University. Dr. Ha is a leading top scholar in international relations. In Korea, he has made excellent contributions to the field, to not only policy circle, but also the academic scholarly community of international relations, IR theory, diplomatic and conceptual history. He served as a member of the National Security Advisory Group for Presidents, Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye before, and also a Presidential Committee for Unification Preparation, as well as the Inter-Korean Summit Talks Preparation Committee. He authored extensively on foreign books and politics, roughly more than 50 books. So I'm really thrilled to host this dialogue from two great thinkers. And at this time, I'd like to turn over my microphone to Dr. Ha.
It is my pleasure to discuss the current state of world affairs and the post-COVID-19 era with globally prominent guest, Dr. Richard Haass. I think our discussion is very much timely in two senses. First, after the global diffusion of COVID-19, we are experiencing difficult troubles in managing the disease. In addition, as our discussions on the future of post-COVID-19 world order is confusing, we do need to signpost our future. Second, Richard's new book has recently come out as an excellent introduction to understand the world. We will begin our session today with a brief introduction of your book, The World, a brief introduction. Could you provide us with a brief overview of the book, Richard?
Well, thank you, Dr. Ha. It's good to be with you, sir. Good to be also with my friend Yul Sohn. And any collaboration with the East Asia Institute, with EAI, is most welcome. It's an important institution, not just in the Republic of Korea, but in the world. So again, it's good to be with you all. The reason for writing this book was very basic. There is on one hand, there is the objective importance of the world. It may seem obvious, but a lot of people, particularly in my country, I would argue, do not understand just why and how the world matters so much to their lives. Or to put it another way, for a lot of people, foreign policy is foreign, and it is not a priority. And I am worried about the gap between the importance of the world and, in many cases, the lack of understanding. And I think it's important for any democracy for the public to understand foreign policy, to be involved in it. It's the only way to ask important questions of our political leaders, our representatives. It's a way to hold them accountable. It's a way, if you have public support, it introduces a degree of continuity into foreign policy, which can be critically important. And also, if you have public support or involvement in foreign policy, it tends to resist the temptation of isolationism. And, or to put it another way, if people don't understand why the world matters, if they don't understand why what they do in the world matters, it will allow a country to drift into isolationism. And that is something I very much want to be resisted in the United States. This is a book that basically discusses history, the history that I think people need to know. It introduces the various regions of the world, Asia Pacific, South Asia, Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. It introduces the important global issues of our time: climate change, terrorism, proliferation, infectious disease, trade, what have you. And then it discusses how we organize the world, how we build order. I would just say one other thing. I think this is an important time in history. And maybe this is a transition from describing the book to describing the world we live in for our conversation, Dr. Haass. But we have the traditional issues of international relations. In particular, great power rivalry, the growing rivalry between the United States and China, the renewed rivalry between the United States and Russia, rivalry between China and India, China and Japan, and so forth. This is the traditional dynamic of international relations. But what makes this era so different, what makes the 21st century so different, I would argue, is that in addition to great power dynamics, we have some other things going on. Most important, we have the emergence of these global issues, which I just mentioned, which have the ability to change life as we know it. Right now, the focus is on public health, but in the west coast of my country, in California, we have these terrible fires, which are clearly linked to a changing climate. And then we also live in a world where power is being diffused or disseminated in many forms to many places. You are in the shadow of just that when it comes to North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. So all of this is happening at a time when the arrangements in place, regional and global arrangements, are inadequate. Many of these arrangements date back to the immediate period after World War II. Many new issues like climate change or how to regulate cyberspace are relatively new and have arisen relatively recently. So there's a trend in the world away from order, growing rivalry, inadequate institutions, diffusion of power, global issues that are more and more pressing. And so I think this is a worrying, dangerous time in history, particularly, and I'll end with this, because my own country is less certain than it's been in a long time about what its role is in the world. And like many other countries, we are struggling with domestic issues, COVID-19, massive unemployment. We have problems dealing with race and racism. So it's an important moment in history. And again, I look forward to this conversation with you.
I have two follow-up questions about your book. And the final part of your book, you gave emphasis on the two elements of order and disorder as the basic framework of the world. My first question is dynamic relations of order and disorder. Your historical review of your 4 different periods since the 17th century shows that the emergence of order during the beginning phase of world order is always facing the challenge of disorder during the declining phase of world order. What is your evaluation of the key factor for this cyclical trends of order and disorder? And my second question is about the future of contemporary world order. At the final pages of your book, you draw on a conclusion that the current US-led model, China-led model, and also the middle power-led model in Europe and Asia cannot successfully solve the challenges of disorder and the contemporary world order. Then would you elaborate a little further the alternative model for the future world?
Sure.
Richard?
Two very big questions, and I will do my best. Look, at any time in history, at any time in the world, order and disorder coexist. We always have both. What matters is the balance between the two. If you had a camera, if you took a snapshot, what is the balance? And what also matters is the trend. If you took a moving picture, a movie, which way are things heading? And order usually requires two things. It requires a balance of power, and it requires certain understandings, certain agreements among the powers about how the world is to be organized, about what principles it is to be based upon. And when you have a balance of power and you have some degree of consensus, then the world tends to be fairly peaceful, fairly stable. When there is no balance of power, or the balance of power is challenged by a rising power or by the weakening of existing powers, that usually is a recipe for conflict. What adds to the potential for conflict is a lack of consensus about what ought to be the organizing principles of the world. And we've seen this at various times in history. Before World War I, before World War II, we had both of those elements were there. Shifts in the balance of power. We also had the introduction of new technologies, and then we had a lack of agreement. Two catastrophic wars between in the first half of the 20th century. What's so interesting about the Cold War is there was no consensus, but there was a balance of power and there was nuclear deterrence. So the Cold War stayed cold for the most part because of the balance and deterrence. Each side acted with great caution. The question now, and this takes me to your second question, is can we maintain a balance of power given such things as China's rise, given proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? given doubts in some parts of the United States about our future role. Because what explains power is not just military might, but also the willingness to use it. And I think what also in this era of history, as I was saying, what will affect order and disorder is not simply the traditional considerations of balance of power and a consensus on the rules, but also a willingness and ability to come together to deal with global challenges. Or to put it another way, we could actually have agreement in principle, say between the United States and China about, say, the South China Sea or Taiwan. But if there was no willingness in the world to address climate change or address global public health or deal with setting the rules for world trade, we could have a balance of power. We could avoid conflict. If you will, we could take care of the traditional concerns of order. What I think makes this period of history so different is now we have a whole additional set of concerns dealing with globalization. So this turns out to actually be an extremely demanding period of history where we have to deal both with a traditional agenda, traditional threats to order, and with a new additional set of threats to order coming from globalization. And I think the question is, are we up to it? Will the governments of the world be able to put aside their differences and meet both the traditional and the new challenges? It's interesting, we're meeting now. This fall, this month and next month is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And to me, the United Nations is an example of an institution that cannot play a meaningful role in dealing with what I've described, either the great power dynamics or with globalization. So I think it's going to take great creativity. Institutions like yours will be important, like mine will be important. It'll take great intellectual creativity, but then it will also take political willingness by the United States, China, and other governments to do what is necessary, either to promote order or to prevent those who disagree from succeeding.
Let me now move into the general discussions on the post-COVID-19 world order and the Asia Pacific. Let's start from the post-COVID-19 world order. After the end of Cold War, we did talk about the end of history. Experiencing the COVID-19, we have to talk about the beginning of new history. The basic framework of new history is complexity. The traditional modern actors should rapidly adjusting to the reality of emerging new actors, including coronavirus. New states should include ecological balance. Traditional performances in the world originated from the triangular relations of competition, conflict, and cooperation. New performance should combine self-production and co-evolution for the symbiosis. COVID-19 clearly shows that both the United States and China are not ready enough for the age of complexity. It is urgent to develop a globally shared leadership to manage complex problems of new history. What is your view of the post-COVID-19 world order?
Let me say two things, Dr. Ha. First, I agree with the theme that the pandemic we are now all struggling with, COVID-19, in some ways demonstrates or highlights or reveals the reality that the major countries in the world right now, including the United States and China, are not willing to do what is necessary to meet the challenge. China did not meet its obligations to the World Health Organization. It was slow to respond to the outbreak of the disease. The United States is withdrawn from the World Health Organization, first withdrew its funding. Neither country is participating in the global effort to produce, to develop, manufacture, and distribute a vaccine. So in that sense, COVID-19 has been a disappointment. It's revealed these weaknesses in both U.S. and Chinese foreign policy, the weaknesses of the World Health Organization, the weaknesses in general of global machinery. What it has done, though, in some cases, including in your own country, including in South Korea, in several countries, though, it's highlighted the very good or even excellent performance of the society and the government. So I think again, it's been it's been a bright light, and we've seen how different societies and countries have performed. So some have performed well, some terribly, but I think globally we've not done well. Secondly, more broadly, and there's been a debate in the United States and the world about what impact will COVID-19 have on history. And I have been arguing now for 5 or 6 months that I don't think it will transform history, but I think it will accelerate history. That many of the trends that were visible or developing before COVID-19, many of those trends are reinforced. And if anything, they're happening sooner than I thought, about globalization, about friction between the United States and say and China, about inequality in the world, and so forth. A lack of attention. It's COVID-19 has absorbed a lot of resources, so there's fewer resources available to deal with other subjects. The only place I think I was wrong, and I'm glad to say I was wrong. The one area where the trends have been reversed is Europe. And in Europe, particularly between France and Germany and others, we're seeing a certain revival of European institutions, the European Union, European cooperation. But elsewhere in the world, things look pretty familiar, but not better as a result of COVID-19.
The second topic, our discussion, is about the future of U.S.-China relations. U.S.-China relations have rapidly deteriorated during the last several months. Although some specialists on the issues predict a new type of Cold War between two countries, it seems that China will avoid the risk of direct military confrontation with the United States under the dominant U.S. military capability. Instead, China will assertively pursues its core interests in hotspots of neighboring countries. In addition, China will try to continue tough competition of economy, technology, and norm with the United States. Under these circumstances, what is the prudent U.S. policy toward China for the peace and prosperity of the Asia and Pacific, including U.S., China, and other powers in the region?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's a critical question, and it's one that I've been spending a lot of time working on. I agree with your assessment that this is a critical relationship, and it's a relationship that has been fast deteriorating. I think what we're seeing is a very different China. Xi Jinping's China is different. It's more repressive at home. It's much more assertive in its foreign policy. We're seeing that with Japan, Taiwan, India, South China Sea. We saw what happened in Hong Kong. It has not improved its behavior in vis-a-vis intellectual property and economic espionage. So what I think we're seeing is a changed perception of China, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe. That said, I do not like the phrase New Cold War. China represents a fundamentally different kind of challenge than the Soviet Union. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is integrated in the world economically. I also don't think China has the same kind of global, universal ideological ambitions that the Soviet Union had, but it's a challenge all the same. If I had to say what my goal is that the United States and China manage their competition. And by that, I mean that we have obvious differences with China. We can't eliminate the differences, but we do not want the differences to lead to conflict. We also do not want our differences to make it impossible to cooperate where our interests overlap. So the United States and China may have or do have differences, say, over the South China Sea or over Taiwan or various issues, but we have some overlapping interests on North Korea or Afghanistan or on global public health or on climate change. So to me, the intellectual challenge, the foreign policy challenge, is how do we manage our inevitable differences? How do we manage our rivalry? How do we manage our economic competition in a way that does not make it impossible for us to also cooperate where it's in our collective interest to cooperate? I would say in order to bring this about, I would say several things about the United States and one thing about China. I think we in the United States need to do a much better job of coordinating with allies in Europe and Asia. For example, I think the United States should find a way to enter what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There would have to be some renegotiation, but I think it's essential the United States rejoin the region's principal trade and economic initiative. I think the United States also needs to address some of its domestic challenges, education, infrastructure, race, immigration, the amount of money we spend on basic research. We need to compete with China. So there's things that we need to do for ourselves. I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And this is one area where our foreign policy towards China also needs to begin in the United States. A third thing I would say for the United States, or for both countries, I think the United States and China need much more diplomatic interaction. People always point out that our militaries, our navies and our air forces, the US and Chinese navies and air forces operate in close proximity. I wish our diplomats operated in close proximity. We do not have anything like a serious set of strategic conversations. Going back to your earlier question, Dr. Ha, about what is world order? What is regional order at this moment in history? What ought to be the rules of the road? What are the so-called red lines for each side? And then last, China has to understand something. I've been going to China for many decades, and I do think we're seeing some changes in Chinese behavior, what it's done in Hong Kong, what it's doing with intellectual property, what it's done in the South China Sea. It's broken certain commitments about not militarizing that area. China has to understand that if it acts in ways that are unilateral, or if it acts in ways that do not demonstrate constraint, it will have real consequences. So China has to adjust its behavior if it does not want to wake up in the very near future, finding that its relations with the United States, Europe, Japan, India, Vietnam, I won't speak for South Korea, but conceivably South Korea, in every case, its relationship is worse. And I think China faces that possibility if it continues on its current course of action. So we will have to make some changes. China will have to make some changes. And I think the United States and China have to build a real strategic dialogue.
Both the US and China's government and general public will listen to your advice. Let me move over to the second topic, our discussion. US presidential election is coming soon. Because of the unpredictability of so-called October surprise, it's too early to forecast the next president of the United States. Whoever got elected, the next administration will have a policy review on the alliance strategy in the Asia Pacific. During the Trump administration, the alliance strategy was developed in short-term economic perspective. Thus, it cannot contribute to the long-term US interests. What is your view on the future development of Indo-Pacific strategy in the next government?
Well, again, you talked about an October surprise. It's still early September, and we've had several surprises in September already. The rate of surprise in the United States has gone up. We seem to have several surprises a day now. So between now and early November, we have what, 50, 53, 54 days. There could well be 53, 54 surprises between now and the election. So I have no idea what's going to be the result. And as you've read and heard, it could also be that we don't find out who the next president will be right away. There could be a very complicated situation in dealing with all the ballots, because many Americans, because of COVID and other reasons, will choose to vote by mail. So I think this will probably be a close election, and it could be a very bitterly contested election. But sooner or later, we will have a president. It'll either be Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Whoever it is will inherit a very difficult inbox. One of my sayings is, when you run for president, you can choose your vice president. You can choose the policies you run on. You can choose what you say if you win in your inaugural address. You can choose your cabinet. The only thing you cannot choose is your inbox. And that will be the same, whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden. It'll be a very difficult inbox. I would hope that the next president would spend a lot of time trying to, I guess I would use the word repair America's alliances in Europe and in Asia. I think if Mr. Biden were to be elected, that would be a priority for him. Mr. Trump, however, has a slightly different view of alliances, to say the least. And unless his thinking changes, I do not think he would make the repair of American alliances a priority. He hasn't made alliance maintenance or improvement a priority for the last 3.5 years. You don't need an American to tell someone from the Republic of Korea about the difficulties of the relationship. So again, unless Mr. Trump has a change of heart, I don't see I wouldn't predict there'd be a significant improvement in our Asia-Pacific alliance system. I would hope, though he would rethink it, particularly if he wants to pursue a serious policy towards China. The best way to pursue it is not unilaterally, but is with our allies and partners. So I hope he will come to see that logic. Mr. Biden, I believe, would certainly see that logic. Let me say two other things about the next president. One is, I think whoever the president is, it's going to be a difficult relationship between the United States and China. The friction is not simply a result of Mr. Trump, but I think a lot of Americans, Democrats and Republicans alike, have a more concerned view about China and the direction it is taking. And second of all, who's ever elected, I said, is going to inherit a difficult inbox. An important part of his inbox is going to be dealing with the domestic situation in the United States. Is going to be dealing with COVID-19. Is going to be dealing with the tens of millions of unemployed. We're going to have very deep political divisions, possibly even deeper, coming out of this election. We've obviously got all the challenges dealing with race and racism. So the next president is not going to have the luxury of just being a foreign policy president. He's also very much going to have to be a domestic president.
Final topics of our discussions. In spite of efforts of Singapore and Hanoi summit, North Korea has continuously developed its own nuclear capabilities. During last several decades, both hardline and softline approaches could not stop the nuclearization of North Korea. I would rather argue that we do need a much more complex strategy of combining sanctions, deterrence, and engagement. In addition, North Korea's self-reorganization of their own survival strategy in the 21st century is absolutely necessary. For the final goal of North Korea's denuclearization, I would like to hear your advice on this issue, on these issues for your next administration.
You know this issue better than I do, and this is the way you set it up, I think, is right. We have tried various approaches to North Korea. To use an American expression, we have tried honey and we have tried vinegar, and we don't have much to show for either. There was once the former American Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, was once asked about the Soviet Union and the American defense establishments. And he said, when we in America build more defense, the Soviets build. And then he said, when we don't build it more, they still build. And in some ways, that's the way with North Korea. We've tried honey, we've tried vinegar, we've tried diplomacy, we've tried summits, we've tried sanctions, we've tried threats of force, we've tried incentives, and we don't have much to show for it. What we see is a North Korea that remains closed, remains heavily militarized, and obviously has increased its nuclear and missile capabilities. My own view is we should continue to hold to the long-term goal of denuclearization, but I don't think that's something we can negotiate. I think we should be open for the foreseeable future to partial agreements. And essentially what I call in my informal English, something for something. We would be willing to give North Korea a degree of sanctions relief in exchange for their taking certain steps in the nuclear area. Look, we've tried things like this before. I can't guarantee it would work this time, except I think the sanctions have been quite effective. North Korea has to deal with the fact that it, to some extent, opened up, allowed the these summits to happen, and doesn't have much to show for it. I would be very direct with China and Russia about our expectations of what they do there. But I would be open to, if you will, more traditional diplomacy with North Korea, and we would have what I would hope would be agreement on where we want to go, and then we would be willing to do it in steps or stages. I can't sit here to you and guarantee it will work, but that seems to me preferable to ignoring this problem or thinking that regime change will somehow come, or saying denuclearization or nothing. I think if we make this an all or nothing negotiation, we'll have nothing. So again, I think we should keep denuclearization as the long-term goal, but I think we should be open to interim agreements toward, down that path. And I think it's something that the United States and the Republic of Korea, Japan, need to coordinate very closely on in the first instance, and then obviously we've got to include China and Russia in those consultations.
I received quite a lot of questions, especially to you. Let me introduce some of the questions selectively. The first one: what were your expectation of the Trump administration foreign policy back in 2017 when it just inaugurated, and how much were those expectations met?
That's a good question. I knew Mr. Trump before he was president. I knew him from the world of golf and also living in New York. And then when he was a candidate, he and I met. He asked if I would come by and talk to him about foreign policy, which I did one day at Trump Tower. He did not have highly developed views on foreign policy at the time, but he had two things that came through. One, he was very critical of America's trade agreements. And secondly, he was very wary of foreign policy in general. He seemed to think that his approach to foreign policy, that it involved more costs than benefits. I disagreed on both. I basically argued the value of free trade to the United States overall. And I, as you would expect, talked about how the United States over the last 3/4 of a century, since World War II, I believe our involvement in the world has brought far more benefits than costs to the United States. I think this has been a remarkable era of history for us, in part because of us. Needless to say, I did not persuade Mr. Trump of the wisdom of my views. I did think, however, that once he was in office, he would evolve, that he would become more traditional, and he is not. For the most part, Mr. Trump, for better or for worse, depending upon your point of view, but he has not become a traditional president. If you look at all the American presidents from Truman through Obama, they had quite a lot in common for all their differences. Mr. Trump represents something very different. I recently wrote about it in our magazine in Foreign Affairs. He's different from most of the post-war World War II presidents. To me, he reminds me of a mixture of, in the 19th century, President Jackson. He reminds me in the 20th century, some of the isolationists we've had at various times, particularly in the Senate. More recently, people like Pat Buchanan or Ross Perot in their unilateralism, isolationism, protectionism. So he represents very different tendencies in American foreign policy. And so far, at least, I would say he has changed American foreign policy more than it has changed him.
Next question from Sonia. In terms of balance between order and disorder, you are saying today in recent writings, the world is tilting toward disorder, disarray, or strategic deterioration. What would be the end state of disarray? War or peaceful reordering by American resurgence, or else?
It's interesting you ask. My last book, not the current book we talked about tonight, my last book was titled A World in Disarray. And sometime next year, I will bring out a new edition of that book in paperback. And I've been thinking about it, but increasingly, I think if the world, if disarray continues to grow, if the current trends continue, the balance between order and disorder will tilt in the direction of disorder. We could see more conflict. We could see more failed states. We could see, in particular, the ravages of climate change. We'll see a much more fragmented internet. We'll see the much weaker global trading system. I could go on. It's not a pretty picture. And I would say, if I'm right, this is a world of growing disorder, but nobody really benefits. This is not a China-led world. This is not an America-led world that I've just described. This is a world that is increasingly not led. And it's a world that begins to unravel in certain ways, that the old institutions are not adequate, new institutions do not come into existence, and the balance between disorder and order, or between the problems and the responses, becomes more of an imbalance in the wrong direction. It's a pessimistic future that I've just described. The good news, Dr. Haass, is that is not inevitable. The bad news is that it's possible. And what worries me is we're not doing things to make it less likely. I worry about the trends. I worry about the drift.
There is another questions, interesting questions on the globalization, deglobalization, and reglobalization.
Yeah.
Why we have experienced during recently the deglobalization? What is the determining factor for that kind of phenomena?
It's very interesting. We are seeing elements of deglobalization selectively. For example, one area we've seen it in Europe and the United States is against the movement of peoples. Far more opposition to immigration and refugees. And lots of reasons for this, some of them economic, some of them cultural. This pandemic, what's so interesting, this is a global health challenge, yet most of the responses have been national. We don't see a lot of global response here. Trade, the last round of global trade talks, the so-called Doha round, as you know, went nowhere. And now increasingly trade is not dealt with at a global level. It's dealt with at a bilateral or trilateral or regional level. And even the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO is essentially not working well anymore. So I think there are powerful forces, if you will, of deglobalization. The problem is they won't prove adequate. So in certain areas, globalization, like climate change or disease, there's only limited things countries can do. And so to me, one way to think about it, as you set it up, is globalization versus deglobalization. But I think there's limits to how countries can elect to opt out, not to be a part of globalization. To me, the real debate is not between globalization and deglobalization, but it's between multilateralism and either isolationism or unilateralism. Do we come together to deal with globalization or not? And I think there, I'm sad to say, so far at least, the response has been inadequate. There we have a choice. In many areas, when it comes to globalization, we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice on climate change. Climate change is going to come to us, whether we like it or not. COVID-19 came to us for the most part, whether we liked it or not. We can opt out of certain things like immigration or trade, but we do it at a real, I would argue, at a real cost. So to me, the policy debate is how do you deal with globalization? And I think there will be, whether it's multilateral, whether it's unilateral, or whether it's isolationist, and I think that is emerging as one of the big questions of our time.
But facing the relative decline of the United States, do you believe that the U.S. is fully ready for that kind of suggestion you mentioned?
I'm not sure I understand. Could you please explain a little bit more what you're saying?
Facing the relative decline of the United States,
Well, look,
it seems
okay.
that the United States cannot rather easy to manage it, a kind of the shared leadership coming out of the U.S. first approaches?
It's a good question. You know, we can talk about America first, we can talk about unilateralism, but I don't think any of that is a viable foreign policy for the United States. It certainly won't succeed. Now, the question is, are we willing to rejoin multilateral institutions? Are we willing to work with others, with our allies and partners and others to shape this world? I don't know. You know, for a while, during the Cold War we did, but the United States was clearly in the lead. Then after the Cold War ended, we enjoyed a temporary position of primacy, but that couldn't last. And so you're right, our relative position is weakening, relative, not absolute. And the question is, that's not bad per se. For example, after World War II, the relative position of the United States weakened, and we did it on purpose through things like the Marshall Plan. We wanted to strengthen others. We knew we needed to strengthen countries if they were going to be partners in the effort against communism. So to me, the goal of American foreign policy cannot be to remain, quote unquote, number one. Countries like China will rise or not rise based upon what they do. The challenge of American foreign policy is, again, to build coalitions, to build partnerships, to deal with traditional problems or new problems. And are we willing to do that? I hope so. In many areas, though, this administration is not. We'll see. I think Americans, again, it comes back to my book in some ways. One of the reasons I wrote this book is to make more Americans aware of the fact that the world matters, that what happens in the world will affect the quality of life in the United States, and that we have to work with others to shape the world in ways that are good for us, that we can't ignore the world, that isolationism is not a serious option, and we can't do it unilaterally. America first, to me, is not a serious option. We need to act in the world, we need to lead, but we need partners. And that is the argument I am trying to make. Ask me back in a few years and we'll see how persuasive I've been.
Final question is I would like to introduce to you. How do you project changes in North Korea policy of US if Mr. Biden is elected? Will be differences with Obama administration's one, that in the situation of development of nuclear weapons of North Korea and in the situation of having nuclear weapons of North Korea?
The short answer is I don't know. In my previous job in government, I used to say I was in charge of policy planning, not policy predicting. I don't know what Mr. Biden would do. I don't know who's going to have the top jobs in a Biden administration. But they're going to face a North Korea that you know better than I do, with its nuclear capabilities, its missile capabilities, its conventional military capabilities, its political and economic nature. And as you say, we've got a history of dealing with North Korea. We fought a war with North Korea. We've tried, again, diplomacy. We've tried traditional diplomacy. We've tried dramatic summitry and personal diplomacy. We've tried sanctions. We've tried incentives. You'll probably have people involved who have a lot of experience from the Obama years or other years. So I don't think there can be something fundamentally new. To me, again, you heard what I think we should do, which is go back to a more traditional arms control approach to try to put a ceiling on the problem to gradually reduce the problem. But I don't think we can afford to ignore the problem. And I don't know of any way to solve the problem overnight, either with military force or diplomacy. So I think we're going to have to operate in that very frustrating but realistic gray area of managing the problem, gradually limiting the problem. I think that's probably the best the Biden administration, or for that matter, a second Trump administration could do.
Okay, we have reached the end of this seminar. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Especially thank you, Richard, for your insights on the difficult questions you sincerely responded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to my friend Yul Sohn, and thanks to all my colleagues at EAI. It's always a treat to do things with you.